Hello, you dirty potters. How are you today? Today we're going to talk about oxidation versus reduction firing. If you're a new potter in the pottery community, you probably don't know what they are, but you've probably heard these words before. What are they? How do they translate to my work? When I buy a kiln, will I get an oxidation or a reduction kiln? Like, will it actually matter? Does it matter to the bisque? Well, today we're going to go over some of those things. Firstly, we should get this out of the way. The type of kiln that I have is an electric kiln. Throughout your pottery career, you're going to meet a bunch of different types of kilns. All different sizes, different shapes, different firing processes, but the one that a lot of people have in their homes are electric kilns, and that's because we have electricity in our homes and not so much just like fire laying around. The way that people with electric kilns, such as myself, heat up their work and make sure that the glass is fused to the product and do their bisque and all that kind of stuff is with the electricity in their house. We have elements or coils inside of our kilns that heat up, and those are the things that do the heat work inside of our kilns through the process of electricity. But most electric kilns are considered oxidation kilns. I say most because there are a couple kilns that I've met that are like neutral fire kilns, where they're a little bit oxygenated, but also, you know, they kind of do a little bit of something else in between. And I've also met a couple of these types of kilns that have been turned into raku kilns as well. And those technically are a different firing process altogether. So if you're sitting at home wondering, is my kiln an oxidation or a reduction kiln? If you have an electric household kiln like I do, you probably have an oxidation firing kiln. Let's start off at the base. In ceramics, we throw our stuff on the wheel, or we sculpt it, or we do whatever we do to it with usually a bit of water, and then we let it dry out to the bone dry phase. Once it's in the bone dry phase, we put it in the bisque kiln to be fired the very first time. This is just considered the bisque. You're getting the water out, you're letting it be a little bit more handleable when it comes out so that you can glaze it a little bit more, it absorbs water a little bit more. It's awesome at that phase. It doesn't really matter whether it's oxidation or reduction at that point. People do reduction bisque firings, they're out there, but at this point, that's not what we're really worried about. When we potters talk about oxidation versus reduction firing, what we're really talking about is the glaze firing process. Oxidation firing just means that in the glaze firing, there's enough oxygen floating around the kiln for the combustion of fuel to take place. But usually, when we talk about this, we're talking about a gas firing kiln. As I said before, I have an electric kiln, so I don't have to worry about the combustion of oxygen as a fuel source for fire for heating up my kiln. My elements do all the work for me through the use of electricity. When we're talking about oxidation versus reduction, most people are usually talking about using fire as a source of fuel, but this would include, in an oxidation firing, having enough oxygen to flow throughout the kiln in order for the fire to use it as combustion as a fuel source for heating up your kiln more and more and more. There's these things called dampers and flumes on the kiln that you can kind of manually adjust to let air in and out of the kiln so that you can adjust the amount of oxygen going in or staying out of the kiln. In a reduction firing, especially when you're using a gas-powered kiln, it's the exact opposite. You're trying to reduce the amount of oxygen in a kiln. That's why it's called a reduction firing. They're trying to reduce the amount of oxygen in the kiln by certain processes. This might be closing or plugging up the flumes or the dampers. This might be pushing more fuel into the kiln, into the chamber, so that the fire uses it as a combustion point. Because fire technically uses oxygen as a point of combustion and fuel, you can technically force way more fire into the kiln so that it can use up all of that oxygen. It's actually really interesting because when you close up like all the holes where oxygen would get into a gas-fired kiln and you increase the amount of gas, the amount of fire in the kiln, the oxygen still has to burn, right? The wear still has to heat up, the kiln still has to work. So that fire, knowing that there's not a lot of oxygen molecules around, will often borrow a lot of oxygen molecules from either the surrounding environment or the glaze inside of your pottery. Yeah, it can do that. It blew my mind the first time too. The fire will actually borrow oxygen from your clay and glazes and use them as a fuel source, which generally changes the look of your pottery. One of the more common reactions is that whenever you put copper inside of an oxidation kiln, it turns green, right? It's copper, of course it's green. But when you put it inside of a reduction kiln, that fire ends up borrowing a lot of the oxygen molecules from the pottery and the glaze itself, which turns it like this weird bloodish kind of red, and it's awesome. There are some beautiful reds that come out of reduction kilns. A lot of people actually choose to do reduction firings for this very reason. When I was a baby potter and I was in school, I actually grew up using a reduction cone 10 kiln for like the first 4 years of my life, and then I went to a studio and did my own thing and used an oxidation kiln, but it was really big, so the heat worked a little bit differently. Now that I have my own kiln, I understand the difference in between I understood it before that, but when I was kind of in school, I just thought that this was all kilns. I thought you needed fire for every process. So when we talked about oxidation and reduction, and we always did reduction firing, I just thought that's the way kilns worked throughout the world. That's not true. Now that I have my own couple of kilns, actually, I know the difference and I know how they react with the chemicals inside my glazes and my clay. But that being said, if you're looking for an explanation in reduction versus oxidation, that's it. It's really just oxidation, oxygen in the kiln chamber. Reduction, reduce the amount of oxygen in the kiln chamber. That's all it is. Well, thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. I hope that helped some of you beginner potters. I feel like this is knowledge that you kind of come across at a later time when you start messing with other kilns. But when you're a new potter and you hear these terms, you're like, I don't know what those mean. It all really just has to do with reduction of oxygen or the presence of a lot of oxygen with any kiln. That's all it is. Just remember, reduction is reduce for oxygen. Oxidation is just straight oxygen in the kiln. That's it. Simple as that. I will link another video down below for you in the description below this video, just in case you want another source. I mean, it's always good to get multiple sources, right? You just can't believe everything that everyone says. But I think that you should see some other information as well. Plus, this one has pretty pictures and me small brain, so it helped me lots. But thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. If you found this information helpful, click the like button. That way YouTube doesn't hit me while you're not looking. You guys have a fantastic day. Good luck on your next art projects, and I will see you, Dirty Potters, next week. You know, it's funny, I actually remember a long time ago, people, when we started moving towards oxidation kilns, would try and get reduction stuff out of their oxidation kilns. So you would get potters who would like light incense and like try and stick them in the peepholes of their kiln. Like, oh, if I just put smoke in there, it might help a little bit, right?